Now we are going to be discussing the third book in the series, supported by Adobe Creative Residency Community Fund. And today it's The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, that was originally written in, I believe, 1915 and published in 1918. One of the most famous and most defining works of Kafka's, and also of almost the entire literary tradition of existentialism, and one of the probably most defining literary works of the 20th century. I have no idea why I haven't read it up until this point, but I thought, this project is a great opportunity to finally read it and study it and dig a little bit deeper in what it means for history of literature and history of philosophical thought. So the reason why I chose that book is just basically all of that. It is so influential and it's so well known. It's so defining in what Kafkaesque means and what Kafka wrote about. It's really incredible how everyone, even people who have not read any of Kafka's work, really know who he is. He has died when he was only 40 years old, so he only had a few decades of really productive and not so productive at the times literary career. And The Metamorphosis is probably the book that defines him the most, alongside a couple others like The Trial and the Process. So this is Kafka. He wrote The Metamorphosis when he was still pretty young, and he held a job at the time. He wasn't a full-time writer, but he had to work as a clerk to make a living, and he wrote in his spare time. And The Metamorphosis is a reflection of that, and is a reflection of his thoughts on what office jobs mean for humans. And I knew quite a lot before I actually read the book. I knew about it, which is different from some of the other works that I chose for this project. There are hundreds of covers from books published in different languages, and also the many editions of The Metamorphosis in English. It was originally published in German, but a lot of the books, and dare I say most of the books and the covers, feature this beetle or dung beetle or almost roach-like creature that people mistakenly think the book is about. So this is an image that everyone seems to be very familiar with, but the thing that I found interesting, it's always incredibly daunting and incredibly tricky to cover something that already has hundreds of covers. There's pretty much everything has been done before, but when Kafka wrote this book, in a letter to his publisher, he actually said the insect is not to be drawn. The insect that the book is about is not to be depicted on the cover, and it is not even meant to be seen from a distance. And as we just saw, a lot of the book designers now and before, throughout 20th century, were kind of ignoring that direction from him. And so this is the original German cover. 1916 is the year of when it was published, as a work of an emerging young writer. And this depicts a man who is terrified or tired or disgusted or scared. We don't know for sure, because he's covering up his face with his hands and an open door. these are some other covers that I thought were a little bit more interesting, and this is a bit of a direction of off the beaten path. And I don't mean to, when I say that, you know, the covers with bugs is something that I don't think I could be doing or should be doing. I don't mean to criticize it, because it's a very nice, and it's a very straightforward way to try to visualize the main character and who the book is about. It's obviously, you know, it's a move that you would expect a lot of illustrators and a lot of publishers to make, but if you don't do that, what can you do? So one of the things that you can be doing is, like here, using art that's either, you know, drawn specifically for the cover, or like in this case of a cover in Russian on the right, it's art by Juan Carlos Liberti, who is an Argentinian artist doing work that was kind of secondhand surrealism, interpreting some of the famous 20th century surrealists and artists like Dali or Magritte, being inspired by that. But I think that overall these covers have kind of still the interesting mood and interesting feel to them. And the second one in the center is about a family, which this book is about. And then also we have even more different treatments of the cover. The one on the left is by Peter Mendelssohn, who, you know, talked a lot about how, you know, he thinks it's very important to not fall into the trap of trying to draw the insect. So he did this incredibly clever interpretation of half man, half insect. And then, you know, again, the doors and the bed and the window are some of the symbols that are referenced in the book, and trying to make something that's kind of impersonal, that abstracts the identity of the main character, is all the path that I find very interesting and justified by the contents of the book. So then, this much I knew before I started, but what does the book actually tell us? So I read the book. Obviously, you know, this is about traveling salesman who's called Gregor Samsa, who lives in Prague in around 1915. He is a sole breadwinner and provider for his family, of his dad and his mom and his younger sister, and he you know, has no friends, he has no joy in life. And then the book begins with him just finding himself transformed into some sort of giant insect or vermin or bug of some sort. And the language that Kafka uses is incredibly precise, but, you know, it's solving the idea that he has. It's vague, and it's not anything that you would imagine reading, I think, before Kafka. It makes a really big impression in how, you know, it's absurdist but realistic at the same time. So after I finished reading this novella, I, as I usually do, generated some verbal ideas, concepts by, you know, recording phrases and moods and words and descriptions that stood out to me in the book and that I highlighted while I was reading it. The book is originally, of course, written in German, and I don't speak German, unfortunately, so I read it in translation in English. The translation that I read is one of the more widespread these days in, you know, Project Gutenberg and some other public domain resources for literature by David Wiley. So, you know, these are descriptions of the moods and some of the events and some of the memorable, you know, things like coffee gushing on the carpet, and the wallpaper, and the little framed picture that Gregor had in his room, and the little red apples that he got hit with, and also just bigger things like trauma, dirt, and death, and transformation, and being locked in a small room, and crawling around the ceiling, and feeling discomfort, and feeling fear. This is what the book is about. So I wrote all this down, and this is my starting point for generating the cover ideas. One of the most important questions, because Gregor is the main character in this book, is what kind of bug, who is he? Because obviously to imagine what you're reading about, you have to imagine something. It's very hard to read a piece of literary work without being able to visualize what you're reading. And in this case, Kafka makes it incredibly hard, and this is one of the most interesting things about the book itself, because, you know, in original German, he uses two words, Ungeruch and Ungeziefer, and both of these start with un, which means that it's being defined not by what it is, but what it is not. And the rough translation, you know, that I studied and I read about this from what the literary critics and cultural critics write, literal translation would be close to saying something that's a vermin. So someone who is not necessarily productive member of a society, and that's a key idea that I think Kafka wanted to convey. And this literary critic, Susan Bernowski, says that Kafka wanted us to see Gregor's new body and his condition with the same hazy focus with which Gregor himself discovers them. So he wakes up one morning and he doesn't necessarily know the taxonomy of what kind of bug he is. He doesn't know. He has no idea what happened to him. He doesn't know why, and he doesn't know what to do. And he kind of, you know, as we know, you know, spoiler alert, he pretends to be, he pretends to go about his life as he used to. He doesn't realize what has happened is going to change his life dramatically, and then obviously he fails and really becomes a burden to his family, and passes away because there is no purpose to him existing. So there's also other words that are mentioned, either, you know, in the book or in letters that Kafka wrote to his publisher and other people about the book. In one place he says insect, in referring to Gregor, and you know, I like to do a quick Google Images search to see what's gonna come up, and not to go into detail about what insects are and what the definition of an insect is, but just have a verbal and graphic vocabulary of that, what that is, and you know, what is an insect and types of insects. And then we could also say, you know, there is a word bug that's mentioned in passing. So we could look what bugs are, and this includes ladybugs and different beetles and some other creatures, up to, you know, anything like a butterfly. And then dung beetle is something that a landlady says in the book, which is not necessarily meaning that she's right that he's a dung beetle, but that's just, you know, what she sees and how she characterizes him. And this is what a dung beetle would look like. So famously, Vladimir Nabokov, who was a literature teacher and also a pretty famous Russian immigrant writer, thought that he was pretty certain that Gregor was actually a beetle that could fly, that he had wings. He speculated about that a lot, but the question is, if Kafka doesn't define him, does it matter to the reader, and what kind of value does it add to the reader? So I plan to always look at the narrative, and always look at the criticism as widely and as open-minded as possible, but it doesn't mean that it's really relevant. And then going more into the context and precedent and legacy, and what this book means and what it is. I looked at some of the Kafka's diaries and letters, which he was quite famous for, partially because he passed away so early that there just wasn't enough published work of his, and he was around in the really incredibly turbulent period of history in Europe, going through the First World War, and the country that he was born in, Austria-Hungary, has ceased to exist, has disappeared shortly after the Metamorphosis was published. So all of his sketches are quite interesting, and these diaries, the cover is interesting. And then the first edition jackets, there aren't that many, but I thought that this version of case-bound books with a really small but very interesting lettering in red was nice, red and blue for some of them, for all of his main works. And then I found also this cover for The Process, which is his other more famous novel, was really interesting as well. And then, as always, to look into, what kind of environment does this book belong to, and when it was written, and which conditions. We could look at Prague between 1912 and 1918, when, as I've said, Prague was not the capital for the Czech Republic. Prague was a city in Austria-Hungary, and this was during the World War I, when the country ceased to exist. And this is one of the hotels which I believe might have been mentioned in the Metamorphosis, or you could kind of imagine that this was the most fashionable and the most attractive and remarkable building in the city at that time. The top of the Art Nouveau style, which was also called Jugendstil, and originated in Germany. And also Austria was a big center for Jugendstil. It was characterized by a lot of very expressive typography with very interesting proportions, and art like this, which in a way, was connected to movements like arts and craft movements and other movements in Europe and even the Americas, in a way that, this was an attempt to create high art that was rejecting the notion of, the new industrialized society after the Industrial Revolution, and it went back to, very expressive shapes, organic shapes, everything that was the opposite of standardization and minimizing the amount of decorative elements. So this was the world where Kafka wrote the Metamorphosis, and I think a lot of the themes of trying to reject the Industrial Revolution and the new world that was, as we know, coming, a lot of these themes are also part of the book. Otakar Novotny was an architect who was working in Prague at that time, who was about the same age as Kafka, young and promising architect. And this is some of the lettering connected to his projects. And then I came across Wojtek Prasek, who was a graphic designer and artist, who had a very tragic life destiny. He was also about the same generation as Kafka, although Wojtek Pressig was not Jewish, and we know that Kafka, of course, was Jewish, and so he, was a part of the resistance in the war against Nazis in World War II, and he died in a concentration camp in 1942 because he was working on the graphic design for the resistance. And a lot of his early work is really taken and lifted directly from Art Nouveau, French and German directions of the movement, and also he was typographer, and one of his most famous works in typography was this font that he did, which to me is just kind of a perfect reflection of what Jugendstil typography was like, and these shapes just are very reflective of that era. So quite a lot of type designers afterwards made interpretation of this Pressig Antiqua, but I really like the original, but this is a viable a reference that I should be looking at when I think about the Metamorphosis. And then, as a next step, I go to my sketchbook and I sketch up some ideas of, spatial references, of compositional references of how this cover could be arranged and what could be the idea, the overarching concept behind it. And here I'm looking at some of the references as I got from the book, like crawling on the walls and crawling on the ceiling, and some shapes that are kind of bug reminiscent but not exactly bugs. I aim to make this a typographic cover also, but again, I will follow any idea that comes to mind and try to explore it and try to see what works and then select the best one. And then going into refining concepts by bringing all of this in the computer and actually making a cover. Yeah, so we're going to start by creating a document that's 6 by 8 inches, like all the other ones are in this project, and start, of course, with finding some placeholder font and trying to think about the colors and the mood and the style and the composition by interpreting some of the sketches that I did in my sketchbook. And this first one is, I just wanted to start with something simple, all the letters being like this, and I think the idea is that it's like a butterfly transforming, where it's a symmetrical thing, but some of the letters are flipped. It's kind of an abstract idea. Then I had this other idea that, to represent crawling, I would have the letters fall off the page almost, and that represents also change in Gregor, and how, this is almost his descent. This is almost him, turning into something that is not human, and changing that. And then the idea with the room, that is kind of quite similar, where they have a lot of scenes where Gregor just gets so anxious and so bored and so kind of stressed out that he just starts crawling on the ceiling, and he notices that he has this ability since he has become this insect. He spends his days in this one small room, and you know, what he also does is he falls, you know, he hides under the covers, and the little apple is a symbol of, you know, the apples that he gets hit with when he runs away. I believe that his father hits him with those apples. Yeah, and then, yeah, the idea of something being half covered and half visible, and him constantly having to hide under the covers when his sister comes in to clean the room. All of these seem kind of viable or appropriate. And then, you know, this is kind of a riff off of that little first edition cover with the little rectangle. I thought might work. Yeah, I'm using a font here called Oh No Blaze Face by Oh No Type Foundry, which is sort of a placeholder, but I also kind of like the way that it looks. I'm exploring a lot of symmetrical compositions because the symmetry, I think, makes me think of bugs, and it makes me think of the number of the 8 legs that they have, and then also making it into a circle. Circle is a transformation, and, you know, circle is kind of change and nature, and this also has some sort of buggy feeling to it. And here I'm actually trying one of the fonts that I made, that I designed, and all of them are works in progress, so all of them are kind of in the half-finished state, but this was the serif and the sans serif right now is all of the fonts that I drew, and this one is based on a historical reference. And, you know, a lot of the covers that I showed before are kind of brownish or darkish or some sort of beige in tone, which I think works really well because, you know, it's mentioned many times in the book. Like the colors that are referenced is brown specks on white furniture, on the white door, on the white wall. So it's almost like Gregor, in his, you know, insect state, he kind of becomes this substance that makes everything dirty, makes everything brown. And, you know, some of these shapes, you know, something that makes me kind of reminisce about insects and roaches. That's where the colors and the shapes come from. This is also, you know, that same font that I was using before, but it has 2 different directions, so it might kind of work with it going and having 2 different angles and being in that shape. And then I want to explore more of the being in an enclosed small space idea, seeing, you know, if the type could be big, or, you know, what if the type, this is a typeface called Usual by R-Type Foundry. You know, what if I can convey the sense of this industrial revolution coming by, you know, using a font that's almost Helvetica-like. And one thing that's really important about the Metamorphosis is that, you know, it was talking about how, you know, working long hours is dehumanizing, and it's almost like a, you know, socialist book that talks about how, you know, it's a really dehumanizing experience to not have anything in your life besides your work, and to only constantly work for money and work to provide for your family and not have any other joys in life. So this typeface and, you know, these harsh lines and the white background, this is kind of responding to the idea of it being not a humane space. But then, you know, legs and insect legs make me think about this other stuff. And the other idea that I had was about making some sort of symmetrical composition that has letters being transformed and in active state of transformation, or stretching in some way to make kind of a play off of, you know, what the Metamorphosis could visually look like, because that's kind of what still the book is at its core. Because, you know, for any book, obviously the title is always very important. So these are my options, and then I'm gonna be narrowing down on them. So technically this is the second round, and I'm gonna be taking things that clearly do not work, and it's pretty quick for me to narrow this down and see how all of these similar ones, which ones are better, and this ones in the circle, I just didn't think worked particularly so well. But the room idea is kind of interesting, and the idea of the scattered letters falling all over the place is also really interesting. Yeah, and in a way, there's always like a way that I want to recombine ideas, so taking something from one and combining into the other. So here, I'm taking the falling apart and moving all over the ceiling and putting it together with the room idea. And this speaks to how Gregor felt very claustrophobic in that space, but he also felt very claustrophobic in his life, and his life simply just lost all meaning way before he turned into an insect, because the fact that he needed to provide for his family, later in the book we kind of see that was sort of an illusion that he imposed on himself. He didn't really have to work so hard, but the claustrophobia of a square room with white walls that is perfect, it's a sign of the coming anxieties and the coming crisis of the 20th century almost. That is kind of my interpretation. And then I think that this kind of half-hidden thing that's reminiscent of how Gregor was hiding under a blanket or under a sheet when his sister would come into the room. I think that this is also quite interesting and could make for an interesting solution for this cover. So these are basically the three ideas that I have at this time, and the symmetry, the room, and I think I'm gonna be narrowing this down further to see what I can make with these three finalists in a way. Yeah, trying to tweak this first idea. I couldn't quite see how that works with this fonts, except for I really want to try this Wojtek Pressix Antiqua font, and I am not copying anything, and I'm not directly ripping anything off or really appropriating anything, I hope. I'm just taking these ideas and these letter forms from memory and trying to make something that works as a lettering, which is a set of letters that kind of work together. So I'm going to draw the Metamorphosis to see if that could work for my option 1, and this takes a little bit of time. This is really kind of tough to explain, what I'm doing, which principles I'm using to draw these letters, because some of them, they look quite quirky. What I'm doing is I'm trying to make sure that not any two letters are the same. Like, as you can see, I flipped the O so that it's a reflection and it's not identical, so that makes it interesting, that makes it for an interesting texture and not repetitive. Like, if I had a font that looked like that, I would have used it, and the two letters S or two letters O would have likely looked the same, so I'm trying to avoid that. And then the other thing is about the balance, how balanced the letters look, and you could see, I'm grouping them to fix some of the spacing issues, again, because this is not a font, and then I'm trying to kind of even out the weight a little bit so that they look equally as heavy and similar in width, you know, where appropriate. And I can already see that here putting them vertically up is going to be a bit of a challenge because of the different widths of letters. They just don't really look as nice when they're stacked vertically. So trying to make them wider, but don't think that that necessarily works really well. But you know, we can always put this aside and use the letters somewhere else. So then, can I use this for this other third idea that I have with letters peeking from under the curtain? So I have to draw Franz Kafka because I don't want to use two different styles. It's gonna be too messy for a cover that's like 90% white space. Don't want it to be too messy. So I'm drawing the Franz lettering here, and a lot of the letters I already have, thankfully, but then I think the K is something I need to draw, and it has to be, it's quite tricky because it has to be a part of the same family, but it can't be exactly the same as the R, and I have to balance it, so, you know, always kind of pulling this bottom leg more to the right is helpful. And here I just flip this, connecting a stroke to make it same family but different again, like I was doing with different characters, and then flipping some of the cross bars for the A's so that they look slightly different. And then I'm seeing how, you know, I could edit this into this third idea to see if that would work. And it's kind of a collision of two concepts. You know, again, maybe that would work smaller, but I don't think so. It kind of becomes this cross shape. And then go into the second idea to see, you know, if this is the one that is my favorite. Usual, this font that I used before, that is sort of belongs to the same family as Helvetica or other, you know, humanist grotesque like Universe and everything, you know, that emerged from mid-century on and is still widely used now. In a way, you know, for I think many people, there is no straight line that connects that to what I'm doing to the world of Kafka, to the world of Metamorphosis, whereas that lettering that I just drew does connect directly. But an interesting point here is that, you know, maybe I want to try something that's more about what the book is about and what the feeling of it is and what it would, how it would talk to today's readers, as opposed to what originally the author was trying to say in the world that has already changed since then. So I, you know, have two ideas. I narrowed down to two now, and basically I think that you know, there is still some merit to this one, and changing the frequency of the wave helps, but I think that this one is a stronger one. If it's a white background, you know, maybe it's a bit more clear of what the idea is, using lines, and I'll tweak a little bit the proportion of that end wall in the center of the frame and make this novella thing angled. And then always, you know, I try to try as many things as I can. So I would, you know, as soon as I kind of narrow down on the concept, I'm selecting this top one, I would try as many ways to tweak the idea and adjust it to get it to a point where I think it's the most refined and the most convincing iteration of that original idea that I had. So I try it with different colors, you know, I had some different typefaces, and I tried, here I think we're getting pretty close at this point, but I'm interested in, you know, making it kind of maybe more on the brown side, and smaller typography and larger typography. I think larger is quite nice, and tweaking the weight of this to make the weight lighter, and you know, here I'm also tweaking the spacing a little bit and trying all these different shades of brown and shades of gray. Gregor Samsa's life was really very boring and very gray, and he traveled a lot, but you know, he's also kind of did not take any joy in that. He had no hobbies, he had no friends. He was just trying to make a living, and this is what Kafka says the industrial society and the modern kind of post-industrial revolution economy, market economy does to some of us. You know, adding these lines in yellow, not quite sure that it works, but I have to try. As was always with everything, I want to try it to make sure that, you know, I'm right in my judgment, and you know, if I say something doesn't work, it's because I tried it and I've seen that it doesn't work, not just based on. So I feel like this needs some human touch. So what I'm doing here is I've written a word novella many times inside my sketchbook, and I want to integrate that as a little handwritten element that gives it a little bit of a human touch, and that gives it a little bit of messiness, so that it's not super pristine, it's not as, you know, devoid of detail. And I'm also trying, for that exact same reason, trying the textures, but the textures are hard in this case, where, you know, I find that it's hard to make that work. But with this novella, little scribble, little note, I find that, you know, this is something that could give otherwise pretty minimal and pretty stark cover just a little bit, just enough of that human touch and just enough of that little detail that would be interesting to look at. So I'm trying to do that here, and it can be a smaller scale, and that also is nice because changing letter size and changing the line weight is good to give a little bit of a sense of scale and compositional interest to this book cover, so that it's not so boring and not so straightforward. And I like the brown tones, and still trying to figure out the absolute best way that it would work. And the last step is finalizing. The last step, I would like to you know, go back to white. I think that white for the lines works the best, and then novella would be the same, and I would like to integrate it in this line work like this, so that it kind of sits in that plane. And this is our final comp. This is what we ended up with. Thank you. This was the last cover in the series, supported by Adobe Community Fund. Thank you so much to Adobe for your support on this project, and thank you so much to everyone who checked out the project. And I'm gonna be continuing to work on and then you read, so you can follow it on Instagram, or you can follow it on the website covers.irinagregna.com.